All right, so we've run through the long-term causes of the First World War. We've run through some short-term causes of the First World War. And now we want to take a step back and look at some of those things again and think about the historiography of this war. It's an important skill that you guys need to have to get those highest marks on the IB exam. So we want to take a look at how historians have actually viewed why this war ultimately came to be. Now, to start, since we're just starting our year, make sure you're totally comfortable with what the idea of historiography is. It is the study of historical writing. And so it's not just the things that have happened, that's the history. That's what we're talking about here. This is how people are writing about the things that have happened. So historiography over time is influenced by many factors, one of them being that time. Sometimes there are political considerations. Maybe different political movements are influencing thought in one way or another. Maybe time has revealed new evidence that historians can take a look at. Maybe new documents are found. Maybe time gets to a point where some people might have passed away and others are more comfortable talking about things that might be unflattering to those people from when they were alive. So there's all kinds of things that can influence how a historical story is told and interpreted. And as we're going to find from this, there is rarely a consensus. There's always historical debate to be had. And this is where the study of history can get so much more interesting. So when we're looking at the First World War, we said, well, was it alliances? Were the alliances the main reason that we got into this mess? And some historians might argue, no, absolutely not. The alliances were merely defensive. No one actually had actual obligations, like Russia didn't have to step up and defend Serbia. Maybe we talked about how France was slow, even though they had an alliance with Russia. They still waited a couple days before they ultimately declared war on Germany. And that was only after Germany is entering into Belgium. Britain, they stood up to their treaty alliance from 1839 with Belgium, but not necessarily getting into the war because of what France was dealing with. And Italy, they were a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, but they chose to remain neutral. So maybe it wasn't alliances. Or maybe it was. The alliances contributed to the arms race, as Germany was recognizing that it was encircled by France and Russia, that could push Germany to build even greater militaries to defend against both of them, maybe to expand its navy as well. It contributes to the war plans that are being developed, like the Schlieffen Plan. There is no Schlieffen Plan unless Germany has to deal with an alliance of France and Russia. Germany needed to support Austria and their dual alliance with the Austrians, so they wouldn't be left alone because France and Russia have such a formidable alliance. The Balkan crisis might have just been a smaller regional conflict if not for the alliances that Austria-Hungary and Serbia had. Maybe it's imperialism or not. The main imperial conflicts throughout the war were between France and Russia and Britain, yet they're all pretty much sided together in this war. Now, there are certainly rivalries between France and Germany that could contribute to it. But all of those crises were settled long before July of 1914. So that's that. Maybe it was alliance or imperialism. Obviously, the Moroccan crisis escalated tensions between France and Germany. Germany was also working on building a rail line from Berlin to Baghdad, working with the Ottoman Empire there. Well, this would threaten the Russian and British interests in that region. So maybe it was imperialism. What about that arms race and the militarism? Well, maybe this wasn't the main cause. The biggest confrontations in the arms race were British and German or French and German. But the war actually begins with Russians and Austrians fighting. Was it leadership? Poor leadership down the line. Maybe leaders that couldn't recognize the seriousness of this issue. The Kaiser issues a blank check. not seeing the dominoes that would fall when Austria-Hungary would start that conflict against Serbia. Austria assumed that Russia wouldn't have intervened. They jumped into this conflict with Serbia, assuming that Russia would stay on the sidelines. And by the same notion, Russia is assuming Germany would stay on the sidelines. Britain, sitting along on its own, hoped that things would resolve themselves before Britain would ever needed to get involved. And these thoughts were all wrong. So what is this historiographical record? What has been written about over the last century with regard to the start of World War I? We start with what we call the conventional wisdom or the orthodox belief that at least existed in 1919 when the Treaty of Versailles was ratified. The Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to sign what is called the War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. And this put the blame, the responsibility of the war, solely on the shoulders of Germany. But since then, we've had many revisionist historians. Now, a revisionist is kind of the collective term for someone who looks again at the story. Maybe new evidence is found, and they develop a new theory, or possibly build or add on to theories that had already existed. Now, there's a little bit in today's time, I think there's a little bit of a negative connotation that for some reason comes with the word revisionism. This is thrown around in American politics a lot as that revisionist histories are bad histories. And I want to squash that right now. Revisionist history is not necessarily good or bad. Any histories can be good or bad, but revisionist histories are often looking at new evidence. Maybe as we talked about, new evidence is found, new documents are discovered that might change the way someone is interpreting. Or different historians might put different weight on different factors. It doesn't necessarily make something a bad thing that it is considered revisionist. So immediately in the aftermath of the war, all nations start pumping out documents to proclaim their own innocence, that this war was not our fault. And so we recognize that all of those documents that countries are going to be releasing are kind of loaded. They've got a country's interests in mind. And the argument here is that no one nation is solely responsible for this conflict. You've got Marxist historians who are blaming international capitalism. They're saying it's not all these smaller factors, it's just the point that these Western European capitalist nations wanted to expand to gain the resources of others. We've got some historians, I want you to recognize their names. On the actual IB exam, you don't necessarily have to drop historians' names in to defend their arguments, but it's not a terrible thing to do. In the United States, in the 1920s, late 1920s, a historian named Sidney Fay, he's the guy that first kind of lays out this notion of the main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. This idea that it's not one country or a couple countries, it is these big overarching themes that had existed for the previous couple decades. This is coming out in the late 1920s, and we want to recognize that at this point, much of the Western world, in particular in the United States and in Britain, there's a lot of interest in kind of giving Germany a hand to support Germany. Feelings that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh, too punitive on Germany. So it's not surprising that this theory came from an American historian. Much later in 1961, a German historian, Fritz Fischer, is going to put that blame right back on Germany and argue that it was the German government that was hoping to aggressively expand and allowed this war to develop at the pace that it did. Now, again, it's not surprising that a German historian in 1961 might have this kind of idea. A German historian in the aftermath of World War II, wanting to write about how it's not Germany's fault or the German people's fault, It's German leadership that can drive a nation to make some horrible decisions. And you can understand why a historian in 1961, in the aftermath of the Nazi regime in Germany, might want to put some blame squarely on the shoulders of the government at the time, which, of course, after World War I, the Kaiser's government is gone. After World War II, the Nazi government is gone. In the United States, back in the United States, a more recent historian, John Keegan, is going to point out that it's poor communication between all sides during the July crisis, that nobody was really communicating their intentions or what they were really looking for very well. And it is that poor communication that took a small regional conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia and blew it up into a world war. A more controversial look at this history is from a Scottish historian named Neil Ferguson, who's going to put the blame more so onto Britain for the escalation of this war. You know, if Britain had not jumped in to support Belgium and Belgian neutrality, then this would have been a much, according to Ferguson, would have been a quicker, more regional war rather than this long-lasting, disastrous First World War. And with that, we come to maybe the core of Ferguson's theory is all of those previous alliances, imperialism, nationalism, and militarism, none of them actually led to war. They all existed in the decades before, but it was only in that summer of 1914 that war actually happened. So what is the bottom line? This is still fiercely debated today. Remember, the study of history is not just the study of what happened. It's the study of what happened and why it happened. And the whys are often up for debate. In the case of this war, it seems that the best answer probably lives in the idea that there are many factors and many nations and many individuals that contributed to the start of this war becoming what it became. The IB requires that you take a stand and defend that stance. It doesn't matter what your stand is. It doesn't matter what kind of position you're taking. The only bad position on an IB exam is one that is not supported by the evidence, by the accurate historical evidence you can bring to the table. So if you bring that evidence to the table, and what you've seen here is going to be enough to get you through any one of these papers about the causes of the First World War, you can knock this paper out of the park. So that's that for today, and we'll see you next time.